Good afternoon. My name is Mark Haigney. I am a professor of medicine, cardiology, and pharmacology at the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, Maryland. And I'm going to be talking about our experience with adding the electrocardiogram to the screening of military recruits. I need to give the following disclaimer. The opinions I'm about to express are my own and don't reflect the official policy of the U.S. government, the U.S. Navy, or my university. My funding is from the Defense Health Agency, and I have not received any funding from and have no financial interest in Cardio Insight, whose product I'm going to mention. I do not endorse any commercial product, but I do feel the need to mention it. So what is the problem that we are hoping to address with screening? As we know, sudden cardiac death in the young is a relatively unusual event. The exact frequency of this catastrophic event is not really well established. There are at least 13 studies evaluating sudden cardiac death rate, but they use various methods of case finding, and their estimates of the denominator are unclear. In a very high quality publication by Kim Harmon and others, the sudden death rate in NCAA athletes, which is the National Collegiate Athletic Association in the United States, set the rate at 2.3 sudden deaths per 100,000. Data from 2004, which was the last year we had reliable data in the United States military, suggested that the sudden cardiac death rate is actually considerably higher in the military recruits. So these are young people between the age of 17 and 22 who are entering the United States military, and the rate was 11 per 100,000, so about 4 to 5 times higher than in the NCAA. African Americans had a substantially higher rate of 24 per 100,000. 85% of these deaths occurred during exertion, and this data was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. This just shows a breakdown of the various findings at autopsy. 35% had a completely normal autopsy, and in fact this was the largest group in the autopsy series, and we believe that a substantial number of these individuals died of some primary arrhythmic condition, which would leave no pathologic signature behind. Unfortunately, the first symptom that a young person may experience before having sudden death is often death, and this figure shows that only 7 out of 26 sports-related sudden deaths had premonitory symptoms such as syncope or chest pain, and in the other 19 cases of 20 out of 26, their first symptom was unfortunately fatal. While the electrocardiogram is far from perfect, it actually is quite helpful in identifying the underlying abnormality in many of the causes of sudden death in young athletes. On the left, you see that the EKG is essential for diagnosing Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, atrioventricular block, long QT syndrome, Brugada syndrome. So unfortunately, if you don't do an electrocardiogram, you have no way of making that diagnosis. The EKG is very helpful in other conditions. In hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the electrocardiogram is abnormal 94% of the time. It's helpful in ARVC as well, and certainly in dilated cardiomyopathy. There are some causes of sudden death in which the electrocardiogram is not helpful, and that would include the presence of an anomalous coronary artery, catecholaminergic polymorphic ventricular tachycardia, of course, only manifests during catecholamine stimulation, so the resting EKG is usually normal. Commotio cordis is a condition where the heart is struck through the chest wall by a missile of some sort, soccer ball, a hockey puck, and of course there's no way to predict who is going to get hit in the chest. But it is believed that in at least 2/3 of young people who are going to have sudden death, the electrocardiogram will be abnormal. So in the United States, there is a very strong presumption against using the electrocardiogram as a routine screening test. And this includes in the United States military. Previously, it had been used routinely for all military recruits, and that equals about 150,000 young people per year. In 2002, the practice was set aside, and one of the major rationales for ending the practice of using the electrocardiogram is the high false positive rate seen in young athletic individuals, which, according to the American Heart Association, is about 20%. It was also noted that the American Heart Association does not recommend universal screening for asymptomatic athletes. Further evidence supporting an undesirable false positive rate: in a study of 1,000 pilot candidates, 44% of them were deemed to have an abnormal electrocardiogram, of which, after an extensive evaluation, only 0.6% turned out to truly have a cardiac abnormality. So this suggests an incredibly high false positive rate. If you look more closely at the data, however, you'd see that 94% of these supposed abnormal EKGs were due to sinus bradycardia or first-degree atrioventricular block, which are clearly not pathologic findings in young people. Partly to deal with this question of high false positives in athletes, the international criteria was developed that was intended to recognize the changes that are seen with the athletic phenotype. We did a study attempting to determine whether primary care physicians were capable of applying these new updated criteria, and we found that in general they did a very poor job. So the manual application of the international consensus criteria in the hands of primary care doctors is unfortunately not very effective. Nevertheless, professional sports organizations mostly in the European Union, have adopted the electrocardiogram as a critical screening tool. The most obvious exceptions are the United States professional football, baseball, and hockey leagues, where the EKG is not required. This distinction between American and European practices was very recently brought to the fore by the European Society of Cardiology's latest guidelines on the prevention of sudden death, which suggested that it is a 2A recommendation that all competitive athletes should undergo an evaluation, and that should include a 12-lead electrocardiogram in all athletes under the age of 35. So, as I mentioned before, in the European Union, the electrocardiogram is recommended for all. In the United States, mostly led by the American Heart Association, but mirrored by the Department of Defense, the EKG is not recommended. And I won't go through the arguments in too much detail. I would suggest that they can be reduced to these arguments. First and foremost, that there are just too many American athletes to screen, that there are too many false positives and false negatives, that the EKG's never been proven in a randomized trial to prevent sudden death, that it's just too costly and it's not appropriate to the United States healthcare system. These arguments, I feel, do not apply to the United States military. The United States military, like any military, is dependent on what is known as the tactical athlete. The tactical athlete is distinct from a competitive athlete in that the nature of their activity is not simply to excel, not simply to demonstrate that they're better at a particular event, but is actually to save lives and to accomplish missions of importance to the nation. And for them, defeat may represent loss of life, danger to their colleagues, and the failure of a mission. So an event that might be an annoyance in a soccer player, such as an episode of rapid supraventricular tachycardia, might actually fatally compromise a military mission. And for this reason, I feel that we need to have more intense screening for our athletes. Furthermore, I think there is data that support the notion that screening athletes does save lives, and this is the famous paper by Dominic Corrado that appeared in JAMA, showing the impact on the sudden death rate in athletes compared to non-athletes after the initiation of a mandatory screening program. It's less well known that in the Swiss Army, mandatory EKG screening was initiated, and there was a significant, nearly 50% reduction in sudden death amongst men who were screened with an EKG. The issue of false positivity I've already mentioned, and the answer to this has been to apply the international criteria for for EKG interpretation in athletes, where many of the variants that would be considered abnormal in a middle-aged person are seen as clear manifestations of the athletic phenotype. As I previously mentioned, primary care doctors have a difficult time applying these criteria, and for this reason, a device has been created that automatically applies the international consensus criteria, and this was built by sports cardiologists at the University of Washington, also Stanford, and in NCAA competitors who had a very low prevalence of cardiac disease. This device, which automatically applies the criteria, had a false positive rate of only 3.7% and a very high sensitivity and specificity. When compared to the history and physical exam, it greatly outperformed the traditional approach that's recommended by the American Heart Association, which had a false positive rate of 33%. Similar results were found in high school athletes, and my belief is that this sort of approach, using AI-guided application of updated, expert-driven criteria, will be successful in screening in the military as well as amongst athletes. We had the opportunity to test this hypothesis based on 3 cardiac arrests which occurred at the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 2020. One of these individuals who did not survive was found to have a dilated cardiomyopathy at autopsy. The second, who is actually an aspiring professional football player, died after complaining of chest pain and was found to have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And a third young man had a cardiac arrest while driving his car but survived and was found to have Brugada syndrome. When the superintendent of the Naval Academy was informed that these could have been identified with a screening electrocardiogram, he mandated that we screen the entire undergraduate population. What we found in the first 4,000 subjects was that only 87 were abnormal, and this is applying the American Heart Association history and physical, so asking about chest pain, shortness of breath, syncope, family history of cardiomyopathy, etc., with the addition of the automated EKG, applying the international criteria, and the screening was performed by a cardiologist, and only 2.1% of the 4,000 recruits were felt to need any further evaluation. Of these, the vast majority were due to an abnormal electrocardiogram, 69 out of 87. The other 18 were due to an abnormal murmur that was not thought to be an innocent murmur, or the presence of concerning symptoms or family history. After a full cardiac evaluation, including echocardiograms, MRIs as necessary, genetic testing, we found that there were 21 individuals who had some sort of cardiac abnormality. The 3 that were identified by physical exam were essentially of no consequence. There was 1 bicuspid aortic valve, 1 case of mild aortic regurgitation, and 1 case of incidental left ventricular non-compaction. Of those 18 identified by EKG, 9 cases had Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, which were all evaluated invasively and ablated as necessary. There was a dilated cardiomyopathy with an ejection fraction of 35% in a completely asymptomatic young man who proved to have a filamin C mutation that he inherited from his mother. And unfortunately, we separated him from the Navy, but he is now on goal-directed heart failure therapy and doing quite well. There was another case of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which we also had to remove from the Naval Academy, and as well as several cases that needed prolonged follow-up, including high-density PVCs, 2 borderline long QT syndromes who proved to, in the end, to not meet the criteria for long QT, and then 2 cases of significantly dilated ventricles, left ventricles, that will require follow-up. So the net result was that with a false positive rate of under 2%, the electrocardiogram greatly outperformed the history and physical and identified a number of young people with conditions that are not immediately consistent with service in the military. This data caused Congress to pass a law requiring additional screening at not only the Naval Academy, but West Point and the Air Force Academy. And this screening will have been completed as of today. I'm at West Point, and we'll see the last of 3,600 recruits. And then we are going to gather the follow-up data to determine the true positive rate, and then report this to Congress. And my hope is that we will get a mandate to perform cardiac screening with the electrocardiogram in all 150,000 recruits. Remaining questions: is the physical exam helpful? The sensitivity of the physical exam for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is unknown, and I think it is, based on my experience, well below 20%. And I am unconvinced that the physical exam adds anything to this evaluation. In conclusion, the current cardiac screening in the U.S. military, just as in the screening of American athletes, is not very rigorous, not effective, and certainly less rigorous than what is seen in the European Union. It is my belief that if you're not doing an electrocardiogram, you're essentially not performing cardiovascular screening. So if you are a nihilist and you think that nothing can be done to prevent sudden death in the young, then you might as well give up any kind of screening. If you, on the other hand, believe that saving the 1 in 10,000 individuals is worth doing, then adding the electrocardiogram is the way to go. Thank you for your attention.